Hello and welcome. There is much ongoing debate about one of the most important periods in the history of the Jewish people. When exactly did the Exodus happen? And how long were they actually in Egypt? There are lots of other articles and videos which present different theories. Modern historians and archaeologists also state their views. But when you investigate, almost all of them have serious flaws in their base assumptions, which then results in incorrect conclusions. Personally, I prefer to rely on the information found in the Bible text itself in order to determine the correct timeline. However, sometimes the text is just not that clear or obvious as we consider things from our modern age, and that's why there are so many opinions. I've now released several video series which work through specific historical dates. They've mainly focused on the correct Jewish calendar, the prophecy of the 70 weeks in Daniel, and of the Messiah's crucifixion. In order to help with this research and get an understanding of the entire biblical history, I put together a large spreadsheet. It begins with the year of creation and fills in dates for the entire expected 7,000 years of human history. The dates in the life of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 sons, the time in Egypt, and the Exodus have all been thoroughly mapped out. It continues with the time of the judges, all the various kings of Israel and Judah, through to the time of the exile in Babylon and the return. I want to present some of this information to you and how it specifically relates to two seemingly problematic biblical passages. Now, I'll be honest, there will be a lot of history in these two presentations. A lot of numbers, but a lot of verses to back everything up. Some people will find this presentation dry. Well, if you don't like that sort of thing, then yes, it might be a bit overwhelming. But my goal here is to show that the Bible contains all the information needed in order to figure out these kinds of topics. We don't have to be in the dark. And sometimes we have to realize that what we have been taught some incorrect information and have wrong ideas that we are holding to. I will try to present this as clearly and logically as possible. I hope you come away with a renewed sense of awe of how God has worked through human history. I promise if you stick with me, you will be amazed. So let's begin. There are two Old Testament passages that seem to give specific information about the number of years that the people of Israel were in Egypt. The first is in Exodus 12, 40 and 41. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. The second is found in Genesis 15:13. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But this verse must be considered in context. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." That's Genesis 15:13-16. On the surface, it seems like both the number 430 and 400 are connected with Israel's time in Egypt. But how can both numbers be correct? What are the anchor points in order to verify this information? So let's consider the 430 years first. Exodus 12 is not the only place where 430 years are mentioned. In Galatians 3, 16-17, Paul writes, "Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, which referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. Paul says that the 430 years start with a covenant God made with Abraham and to his offspring. It ends with the giving of the law. Genesis 12:4 states that Abraham was 75 when his father died, and he left Haran to enter the land promised by God. Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." Genesis 12:1 and 2. A few verses later, when Abraham had entered the land, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." Genesis 12:7. The time period ends when the law was given at Mount Sinai. This was 3 months after the Exodus from Egypt, in the same year. On the third new moon after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. Exodus 19, verse 1. Between those two events is 430 years. But what to make of the very specific phrase in Exodus 12 that Israel lived in Egypt for 430 years? The first option is to consider the passage speaking somewhat metaphorically. When Abraham moved his entourage into Canaan, the land God promised to his offspring, he continued to travel further south. In that same year, they experienced a severe famine, and this forced them to spend time in Egypt. Since Abraham was to be the father of a great nation, in a sense, his future offspring entered with him into Egypt at that point. It was then 430 years later when they, as a nation, left Egypt in fulfillment of God's promise. In a sense, this ticks some of the boxes, but it's not a very literal interpretation. So the second option is to investigate the history of the transmission of the text. The majority of the modern English translations of the Old Testament are based on the Masoretic text, which was collated around 1000 AD. There exist several other manuscripts of the Old Testament. One of these is called Targum Onkelos. It is an Aramaic translation of the Jewish Torah and was written near the end of the 1st century AD in Babylon. This is much earlier than the Masoretic text, written 9 centuries later. It too states the time period of 430 years took place in Egypt. The habitation of the Bnei Israel living in Egypt lasted 430 years. However, there are two other, even earlier manuscripts, the Greek Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch. Both include the additional words and Canaan. They state that the time of sojourning within both Canaan and Egypt was for 430 years. The later manuscripts have omitted this information. Here's the Septuagint. "And the sojourning of the children of Israel while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan 430 years. And the Samaritan Pentateuch, now the sojourning of the children of Israel and fathers of them, who dwelt in Canaan and Egypt, was 430 years. So to review, the 430 years start with the year that Abraham first enters the land promised by God and the covenant which promised that he would be the father of a great nation. It ends when his descendants leave Egypt as that great nation, and God gives the covenant of the law later that same year. Now, the 400 years. The Genesis passage which mentions 400 years has a parallel passage in the New Testament. And God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, who would enslave them and afflict them 400 years. Acts 7:6. How old was Abraham when this took place? Genesis 16:16 tells us that it took place around the time when he was 86 and had been 10 years in the land. But notice that God says the period begins with his offspring, after he died. I can't find anyone else who has realized this very important point before. And this will be proven by the end of the series. God promised that Abraham would live the rest of his life in peace. The affliction and slavery would happen to his offspring. The period of 400 years of sojourning begins after the death of Abraham. A surface reading seems to say that they will be servants for the entire period. But is that really what it says? Here we go. Notice that in Acts it is worded slightly differently. They would be sojourners for the entire 400 years. That is, they will not have a permanent home. The time will be made up of periods where they will be enslaved and they will be afflicted, not necessarily both at the same time. The Genesis passage can be arranged in a similar grammatical way. Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. They will be servants, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Being servants and being afflicted are parenthetical statements. It goes on to say that his offspring will return to this very place in the 4th generation. That is quite specific. After Abraham dies, his offspring will roam through the land and will not return to the same spot for 400 years, which would be in the 4th generation. The key is to determine where Abraham was living when God spoke this to him. So Abraham moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. He was living in Hebron, which is south and very close to Jerusalem. After Abraham died and was buried, Isaac settled in a different part of the land, away from Hebron. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Lac-e-Roe, Genesis 25:11. His descendants didn't return to the same area for many years, 400 years to be exact, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Abraham was 175 years old at his death. We can determine that Isaac was 75. Jacob had been born and was now 15 years old. From here, we can continue with the timeline of his offspring. Let's now examine the entire period of the 430 years. We will start this timeline from Terah, Abraham's father. He is the last person mentioned in the first genealogy in Genesis. This will be the anchor point to tie this all the way back to the year of creation. Terah lived 205 years. We find this in Genesis 11:32. We saw that Abraham was 75 when he left after the death of his father in Haran, which is just north in the land of Canaan, or of the land of Canaan, in Genesis 12:4. Assuming that it was up to a year after his father's death, Abraham was born when Terah was 130 years old. When Abraham was 99, God made another covenant with Abraham and promised that he would have a son, Isaac. So Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. finding this in Genesis 21:5. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born. Afterward his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Genesis 25:26. Now Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob. Years after Joseph was sold in slavery in Egypt, he rose to high prominence and managed the kingdom's resources in preparation for a massive area-wide 7-year famine. There were 7 bumper crop years of preparation before this. But in the 2nd year of the famine, Jacob's other sons traveled to Egypt to buy food. They were reunited with Joseph, and he invites his family to come live with him in Egypt. So Jacob moved the entire family and lived in Egypt for 17 years before his death. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. Genesis 47:28. So how many years are we at? For the 430 years, we start with Abraham entering into the promised land. So he's 100 years old when Isaac is born. Subtract 75 years old when he enters the land, and that is 25 years until the birth of Isaac. Now, there's 60 years until the birth of Jacob. And then, taking 147 years of Jacob, subtract 17 years in Egypt, and that is when Jacob is 130 years old when he moves his family to Egypt. So taking 25, add 60, and add an additional 130, we get 215 years. Notice that this is exactly half of 430 years. Now, for the 400 years, we start with the death of Abraham. Taking 147 years of Jacob, subtract 15 years old when Abraham dies, and subtract 17 years in Egypt, that leaves us 115 years from Abraham's death until when the family moves to Egypt. Now let's determine the period of time the people of Israel were in Egypt. This is the main sticking point for the passages that mention 430 years and 400 years. Many people have always assumed that the Israelites were in Egypt for many centuries. But as we'll see, this is not the case. And the answer has always been in the Bible all this time. Joseph was 30 years old when he was made second in command under Pharaoh at the start of the first 7 years of plenty. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Genesis 41:46. A bit of math, and this means that Jacob was 121 years old at this point. So when Jacob was 130 years old when he entered Egypt, subtract 2 years of famine, and just subtract a further 7 good years, leaves 121 years. Joseph lived a further 80 years in Egypt. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. Genesis 50, verse 22. This next part will be quite surprising to most people. Not many know the implications of these particular verses. Jacob had 12 sons. Among them was Levi. We find this in Genesis 29:34. Levi lived 137 years. These are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations: Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, the years of the life of Levi being 137 years. Exodus 6:16. Kohath lived 133 years and had a son named Amram. The sons of Kohath: Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. The years of the life of Kohath being 133 years. Exodus 6:18. The next verse talks about Amram's wife. Pay attention to who she was. The name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, who was born to Levi in Egypt. And she bore to Amram Aaron and Moses and Miriam their sister. Numbers 26:59. While he was in Egypt, Levi had his daughter Jochebed, who was the mother of Moses. This means that Levi was Moses' grandfather. Have you ever realized that before? And if Amram was the husband of Jochebed, that means she was also his aunt. Amram took as his wife Jochebed, his father's sister, and she bore him Aaron and Moses, the years of the life of Amram being 137 years. Exodus 6, verse 20. Now Moses was 80 years old when the 10 plagues of Egypt led to the Exodus, and when he received the 10 commandments of the covenant of God. Now Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. Exodus 7:7. What is the maximum time the people could have been in Egypt then? We have to determine when Levi was born. There is no exact date given in the text, but in Genesis 26:34, the text mentions that Esau was 40 years old at a certain point. Jacob and Esau were twins, and therefore the same age. After that, Isaac sends Jacob north to Haran to marry within his own people group. He works 7 years in order to marry Leah, and then a further 7 years to marry Rebekah. Levi was his third son with Leah. So Jacob's minimum age would be 40 plus 7 years plus a further 3 years, or 50 years old minimum. As was stated, if Jacob was 130 years old when he came to Egypt, that would mean Levi was at a minimum 80 years old at that time. Levi lived 137 years, and at a minimum 57 years in Egypt. It does not say how long Moses' mother lived, however, but her husband lived 137 years. His father was Kohath, who lived 133 years. For the sake of argument, consider that these men had their children in the last year of their lives. The maximum number of years would be Levi, 57 years in Egypt, Kohath, 133 years, Amram, 137 years, Moses, 80 years old during the Exodus from Egypt. And that is a total of 407 years. This does not reach the 430 years which the newest manuscripts seem to indicate was the time spent in Egypt. But we can be even more specific. We can assume that the lifespan of Jochebed was similar to the others in her generation, that is, around 130 years. Since she was born in Egypt, that means the maximum number of years would be Levi, 57 years in Egypt, Jochebed, about 130 years, and then Moses, 80 years old during the Exodus from Egypt, which is a total of 267 years. So the somewhat common assumption of 430 years in Egypt cannot be accurate in the newest manuscripts. What Paul states must be correct, that there were 430 years between God's covenant with Abraham when he entered the land promised until the Exodus and the giving of the law. But we actually do know the number of years that they spent in Egypt. As was determined, there were 215 years from the time Abraham received the covenant of God and entered the promised land to the time that Jacob moved his family from that land into Egypt. That leaves a further 215 years sojourning in Egypt until the time of the Exodus to reach the stated 430 years. After leaving Egypt, the people of Israel spent a period of 40 years sojourning through the wilderness. For the people of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. Joshua 5 verse 6. Now Joshua was 40 years old in the year of the Exodus. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. Joshua 14 verse 7. He died at 110 years of age. After these things, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. Joshua 24 verse 29. So, taking 110 years of age at his death, subtract age 40 at the Exodus, and subtract another 40 years in the wilderness, that leaves Joshua lived 30 years in the Promised Land. After Joshua's death, the people attack and defeat Jerusalem and subjugate the Amorites. After the death of Joshua, the men of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Judges 1:1 and 8. And the Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Heres at Ajalon and in the Shalbim. But the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. Judges 1 verse 35. This fulfilled all the points that God had predicted in Genesis 15:13-16. Let's read through that again. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on that nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." Remember that we saw that Abraham was living south of Jerusalem at Hebron at the time God spoke this prophecy. The Israelites returned to this exact spot in fulfillment of the prophecy. So taking 147 years of the life of Jacob, subtract 15 years old when Abraham dies, and subtract a further 17 years living in Egypt, that gives us 115 years from Abraham's death until when the family moves to Egypt. And from the death of Abraham, we add this 115 years, and we add a further 215 years of the time in Egypt. Add another 440 years of sojourning in the wilderness, and add a further 30 years under Joshua's leadership. This is exactly 400 years after the death of Abraham. After suffering affliction and slavery, the Israelites capture Jerusalem and the surrounding area, and then also defeat the Amorites. So as we have seen, both the 430 years and the 400 years were fulfilled exactly as God had said. The answers were all in the biblical text all this time. And each prophecy addressed different points in the history of the Israelites. But with the Exodus such a major event, it makes sense that it is included in both passages, even though the text makes it seem like the same period of time is being addressed. This whole discussion is another example of how details are so very important. There are centuries of tradition and assumptions built up around these texts. But reading them with fresh eyes and putting together the breadcrumbs through all the biblical texts leads us to the proper understanding of these passages. We have determined a timeline from Terah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, down to the Exodus, through to the conquest of Jerusalem in the Promised Land. The next step is to anchor this to our modern calendar in order to determine in exactly which year did the Exodus from Egypt happen. I hope to see you for part 2.